Hello. Today we're going to talk about To Build a Fire. So by this point you should have read the short story, and you also should have looked over the handout that I made you that I posted on Canvas. It looks like this. I'm just going to kind of walk you through the handout. In class I would ask discussion questions and we kind of go through it together, but here I'm just going to kind of hit the high points, but you'll want to read it more closely on your own. So to start out with, at the top it talks about realism in London's work. We've been talking about this with Henry James some and with Mark Twain, but London is trying to write really realistically in this story, and since many of us are Texans, we might not know too much about hypothermia. But this is from a newspaper article that came out in January 1996, and it talks about kind of the stages of hypothermia and what happens to you when you freeze to death. So if you read this article, you can kind of see that London's character does the same thing as these people do with hypothermia. A few literary terms that we should go over. Some of these are new, some of them are not. We've talked about setting many times. So this story takes place in the early 1900s, and it takes place in the Yukon, which is a region in Alaska. And if we'd been able to do our author presentations, you would have learned that Jack London actually spent some time in Alaska and knows a lot about what it's like to be in these conditions. At the very beginning of our story, we have foreshadowing, or a hint of what is to come later on in the literary work. So I'm going to look over at our text in the very first paragraph, and right in the middle, it says, "There was no sun nor hint of sun, though there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day, and yet there seemed an intangible pall over the face of things, a subtle gloom that made the day dark, and that was due to the absence of sun." So here we have this kind of gloomy setting and this sort of darkness. Even though the man isn't concerned, it foreshadows kind of a dark fate for the man, even in our first paragraph. So we have our setting and sort of our foreshadowing to set us up. And then we haven't talked about plot yet, but a plot is just the arrangement of events in a fictional work. So if you tell a story, it has to be chronological. You move from start to finish, and you go through exactly what happens. But with a plot, sometimes it's arranged differently. You can kind of jump back in time, you can have frame stories like we've talked about. So a plot is just how events are arranged in a fictional work. Now we have a lot of kind of small things that happen to this man as he freezes to death. But our climax, and I'm going to skip ahead to climax, is the point of greatest tension in the literary work, and this is usually the part where everything changes and the story kind of flips. And maybe I'll show you a graph in a second of what that looks like. But in our story, the climax, I think, comes very near the end. And it's the point when he kind of realizes he's going to die. He thinks about killing the dog right before this happens. And then he starts running, and at one point he realizes that he can't keep running. And I think this is sort of the climax, when he's thinking about death, when he knows he's going to die, and then it changes. So we have building until he kind of acknowledges he's going to die as he stops running. Now we have a whole bunch of events that we could call rising action that are leading up to this. So some of our points of rising action, I'm not going to take time to kind of scroll through and show you all of them, but you could argue that when he eats lunch and builds a fire, that's kind of part of rising action. When he breaks through the snow and his feet get wet, and we know that he's going to at least lose some to hypothermia. Or then when he builds the other fire and the snow falls on top of it, that's definitely a point of rising action because it's a big problem for him. When his thoughts make him panic, when he keeps thinking back to the old timer and everything that he's said. And then especially when he lights all the matches at once and they go out, that is definitely a point of rising action, or when he tries to kill the dog. So all of those events could be considered rising action up to the point when he stops running and we know he's going to die, and that's sort of the climax. And everything that comes after that we might call the resolution, the things that happen at the very end. Now before we talk about the resolution and get too far with that, I do want to go over some things about the man versus the dog and what London might be saying through these characters. So with the man, we don't know too much about him. We know that he's new to the area. He hasn't been in the Yukon for too long. He doesn't have too many relationships with people, though he does mention the boys at times. And he's setting out, he's trying to meet up with them. And he and the dog have kind of an interesting relationship. It's not the way that we'd think about having a pet nowadays. He's the master, the dog's kind of the slave. There's a degree of separation between them. And he does have some kind of personal mannerisms about ice being on his beard and him being kind of a solitary creature. But the main things that London is trying to point out about him, I think, are thinking about the way he uses imagination and observation. So if we look at the very beginning on 463, I'm not going to go over to it because I've typed it out in total here, we get this very important sentence. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things and not the significances. So here we learn that though he's a man with rational thoughts, he's not very good at imagining the repercussions. He doesn't think about his own frailty. He doesn't think about humanity. He's just kind of observing what's around him. And then I've given a couple other quotes below that. Look at the one at the very bottom here. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was keenly observant. So he is very good at noticing things around him. He notices when the ice is going to break. He can see the water underneath. He's very careful, but he does not imagine things. And to tell you a little bit about the dog, I have Kaya here, my German Shepherd. And for those of you that have dogs, you know that they do have some kind of instinct to them. Okay, get down. So the dog, rather than thinking these rational thoughts and observing things all around him, he has this instinct and this really deep feeling that goes maybe beyond words. So instincts tell it a truer tale than was told to the man by his judgment. The dogs don't know anything about thermometers or the physical temperature, but they know how to respond to things. So if you have a dog, you know that it will bite the ice out between its toes. It inherits the knowledge. It knows when to be nervous about people. So we have quite a big difference between the man and the dog. And around the time that Jack London is writing, evolution was a brand new thing. Charles Darwin had just sailed on the Beagle. Species were kind of pit against each other with evolution. So some people read this tale as kind of Jack London's impressions of evolution and on if man or dog, or man or nature really, can win in sort of this battle for survival. And so we could argue that the dog very easily wins because the dog is the one who survives. And that's one way that people read the story perhaps more negatively. But if we look at the ending and the role of imagination, we get kind of a different story. So all through the point when he decides that he's going to die and kind of accepts his own death, he's trying to push his thoughts away and keep away imagination. But as soon as he accepts it, kind of in the process of it, he starts imagining things. And there are ways, I think, of seeing the ending as redemptive towards man, even though he dies. So I'm going to scroll almost all the way to the ending of the story here. One second. Okay, so the places where the man is really imagining things, and I think makes the end a little more redemptive. Right before he's dying, he imagines himself as Mercury. Now, Mercury is the Greek god of Hermes, the messenger god that goes back and forth, and he imagines himself almost as a Greek god in this paragraph right here. He's wondering if Mercury felt as he felt when skimming over the earth. So he imagines himself as kind of this deity of sorts. Then, and this is the part where he stops running. He realizes that he can't keep going, that he won't be able to do it. The dog's running with him. But then at the very end here, when he recovered his breath and control, he sat up and entertained in his mind the conception of meeting death with dignity. He thinks he's making a fool of himself, running around with the chicken like a chicken with its head cut off. And it kind of makes him rethink things. He might as well take it decently. With this newfound peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness, a good idea, he thought, to sleep off death. So here we have him freezing to death, but taking it very peacefully, meeting death with dignity. So even though he dies, it's kind of redemptive because he's conscious of it and he has a different way of dying than any other species. His being conscious and his being able to think thoughts, and even this being a short story, I think shows more complexity than other species like dogs or like nature just winning, because they're the ones that survive. Man has this way of imagining things that separates him from all of the other types of animals and from nature. And if we go back to our handout, you can kind of look back through these quotes, think about if you agree with that. Some people think the ending is redemptive because of imagination, others don't. And then lastly, I'd like you to read this part about the two different versions of To Build a Fire and think about why it is that the man doesn't have a name in the version that we read and what that kind of does for you as a reader. All right, I hope you enjoyed To Build a Fire. Thank you for watching.